Welcome back to Hebrew Story Hour. So when we left off, I was trying to remember 2 weeks ago where we left off. We left off with verse 30 of chapter 29. So these chapters between 29 and 32, at least, don't really break off at great points. So we're going to start in verse 31 of chapter 29 and read through chapter 30, verse 24, which is the remainder of the competition between Leah and Rachel. And we will talk, we'll at least pause and stop there. That may be all that we cover today. The next story is between another competition of sorts between Laban and Jacob. Okay, so we'll be starting in 29:31. The Lord bless the reading of his word. Vayar Adonai ki sinu'a Leah, vayiftach et rachama, varachel akara. Vatahar Leah vatelid bain. Lost my place. Vatelid bain, vatikra shemo reuvain. Ki amara ki ra'a Adonai, ba'on yi, ki ata ye ahavani ishi. Verse 33. Vatahar od vatelid bain vatomer ki shama Adonai ki sinu'a anochi vayitin li gam et zeh vatikra shemo Shimon. Verse 34. Vatahar od vatelid bain vatomer ata hapa'am yilave ishi elai ki yaladti lo shalosha vanim al kain karashimo Levi. Verse 35. Vatahar od vatelid bain vatomer hapa'am ode et Adonai al kain kara shemo Yehuda vata'amod miledet. Okay, stopping there. So going back to 31 to translate. Yahweh saw that Leah was hated, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived, and she bore a son, and she called his name Reuben. For she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, that now, or for now, my husband will love me. Verse 33. And she conceived again, and she bore a son, and she said, surely Yahweh has heard, because I was hated, and he gave me also this one. And she named him Shimon. And she conceived again, and she bore a son, and she said, now this time my husband will be joined with me, or to me, for I have born to him 3 sons. Therefore she named him Levi. And she conceived again, and she bore a son, and she said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named him Yehuda, and she ceased from bearing children. Chapter 30, verse 1. Vatere Rachel ki lo yalada leYaakov, Vatikane Rachel ba'achotha. Vatomer El Yaakov, Hava li vanim, Be'im ayin meitha anochi. Verse 2, Vayechar af Yaakov barachel, Vayomer Hatachat Elohim anochi, Asher mana mimech peri vetin, Vatomer hine amati vilcha, or vilha, bo eleha, vatelid al birki, va'ibaneh gam anochi mimena. Verse 4, vatitin lo et bilha shifchata laisha, vayavo eleha Yaakov. Verse 5, Vatahar bilha vatelid la Yaakov bain. Vatomer Rachel danani Elohim. Vagam shama bekoli vayitin li bain al kain kara ashmo dan. Okay, let's pause there and translate. And Rachel saw that she had not born a child or a son to Jacob. And she was jealous. Rachel was jealous of her sister. And she said to Jacob, "Give me sons. If not, I am dying." And Jacob burned hot, or became very angry at Rachel. And he said, "Am I in the place of God that I would withhold from you fruit of the womb?" And she said, "Look, my maidservant Bilhah, go into her, and that so that she might bear a child upon my knees, and that I might be built, even me, from her." And she gave him Bilhah, her maidservant, as a wife. And he entered into her, or Jacob entered her, and she conceived, or Bilhah conceived, and she bore a son to Jacob. And Rachel said, "God has judged me. And also he heard my voice, and he gave to me a son. Therefore, she called him Dan." Verse 7, Vatahar od vatelid Bilha shifchat Rachel, bain shenei la Yaakov. Vatomer Rachel naftule Elohim, naftalti im achoti, gam yacholti. Vatikra shemo Naftali. Verse 9. Vaterelea ki amada miledet. Vatikach et zilpa shifchata. Vatitin ota leYaakov laisha. Vatelid zilpa shifchat Leah leYaakov bain. Verse 11. Vatomer Leah bagad. Vatikra et shemo Gad. Vatelid zilpa shifchat Leah bain sheni la Yaakov. Vatomer Leah ba'asheri ki ishruni banot. Vatikra et shemo Asher. All right, we'll pause there. And so go back to verse 7. And she conceived again, and Bilhah bore, Bilhah, the maidservant of Rachel, bore a second son to Jacob. And Rachel said, "With the wrestlings of God, I have wrestled with my sister. And also I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. And Leah saw that she had ceased from bearing children. And she took Zilpah, her maidservant, and she gave her to Jacob as a wife. And Zilpah, the maidservant of Leah, bore a son to Jacob. And Leah said, this is probably a textual emendation here, but fortune has come. And she called his name God. And Zilpah, the maidservant of Leah, bore a second son to Jacob. And Leah said, I am happy, or in my happiness, for the daughters have called me happy. And she called his name Asher. Okay, verse 14. Vayelech Reuven bimei katsir chitim vayimtza dudaim basadeh vayaveotam el Leah imo vatomer Rachel el Leah tini na li midudai benech. Verse 15. Vatomer la hamaat kachtech et ishi v'lakachat gam et dudae benei or bani. Vatomer Rachel lachen yishkav imach halayla tachat dudae venech. Verse 16. Vayavo Yaakov min hasadeh ba'erev vatetse Leah likrato vatomer Eli tavo ki sachor secharticha bedudae beni vayishkav ima balaylahu. Verse 17. Vayishma Elohim el Leah vatahar vateled la Yaakov ben chamishi vatomer Leah natan Elohim sechari asher natati shifchati leishi vatikra shemo Yisachar. Okay, pausing there and going back to verse 14. Now Reuben went in the days of the harvest of wheat, and he found the mandrakes of the field, he found mandrakes in the field, and he brought them to Leah, his mother. And Rachel said to Leah, give me some of the mandrakes of your son. And she said to her, is it too little you're taking of my husband, that you should also take the mandrakes of my son? And Rachel said, thus he will sleep with you tonight in exchange for the mandrakes of your son. And Jacob came in from the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him. And she said, you'll come to me before, with the wage I have exchanged, or I have paid your price in exchange for the mandrakes of my son. And he lied down with her in that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived, and she bore to Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, God has given my wage, which I gave, or maybe because I gave my maidservant to my husband. And she called him, or she named him, Yisachar. Okay, verse 19, the last section of this story. Vatahar od Leah, vateled ben Shishi, Yaakov, vatomer Leah, zivadani Elohim, oti Zavid tov, hapa'am yizbaleni ishi, ki yaladti lo, shisha vanim, vatikra et shemo zivulun. Verse 21. Va'achar yalada bat, vatikra et shema dina. Vayizkor Elohim et Rachel. Vayishma eleha Elohim. Vayiftach et Rachma. Vatahar vatelid bain. Vatomer asaf Elohim et chirpati. Vatikra et shemo Yosef lemor. Yosef Adonai li bain acher. Okay, so going back, translating this last section, starting with verse 19. And she conceived, Leah conceived again, and she bore a sixth son to Jacob. And Leah said, he has endowed, or God has endowed me a good endowment. This time my husband acknowledge me, or maybe my husband will acknowledge me, because I have borne to him 6 sons. And she named him Zivulun, or Zivulun. And maybe after this, she bore a son, or she bore a daughter, and she named her Dinah. And God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her, and he opened her womb, and she conceived, and she bore a son. And she named him, and she said, God has removed or gathered away my disgrace. And she named him Yosef, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. Okay, this ends that story. The next part is it moves on to Laban and Jacob, and kind of the competition between sheep. All right, so what observations or questions do you have on this? It's quite repetitive. This is a continuation of what we left off with last week, and sort of last time we met anyway, with all of the children falling in line, the actual account of the bearing of the children.
I think there's one question jumps out at me really loudly about this. That's in verse 20. The timing of this word acknowledge.
Yeah.
Is that future tense, he will acknowledge, or is that a reflection that he has acknowledged me? Is it past tense?
No, it's an imperfect verb. So I think she's anticipating that Jacob will now acknowledge her. So future, Hebrew verbs are not necessarily tense-based, but it is, it's not a completed action. So he hasn't acknowledged her. but it could be either may he acknowledge me, or probably more likely now my husband will acknowledge me.
Could it be he has begun to acknowledge me?
It could be, yes, because that's still an incomplete action. So an imperfect verb, yeah, it's at Hebrew is aspectual, so it's either an ongoing action or an action that hasn't yet happened. Imperfect can stand for either one of those. A perfect verb would be a completed action. But so this is an incomplete action of some sort. Yeah, so it could be that he has begun.
He's moving in that direction.
At least she's hopeful that he will be. Yeah.
It struck me that each time through here, until this point, she has done something to initiate this.
Yeah.
But this time, she didn't. There's no exchange of mandrakes. There's nothing going on here.
Yeah.
He just comes to her and she gets pregnant.
Yeah.
Like maybe Jacob is waking up to a little bit to the spiritual character of this woman.
It is strange, like the narrative that goes along with Reuben's mandrakes and all. You have the whole play on. I mean, you have quite a buildup to Issachar, and then you're right, and she conceived again. But there's no like. It seems like in the previous story that Jacob is not lying with or laying at night, spending the night with. Like it's Rachel's permission that Leah gets to spend the night with him. But then you just have this other time that, oh yeah, and she conceived again. So perhaps, yeah, Jacob is, and there's a lot not said, but Jacob is paying her some attention.
I'm kind of following along with my Hebrew Bible and then an interlinear so that I can it helps me keep up with the translating and so forth. In this, it's the Bible Hub apps where I'm coming from. This renders where you use Belendi, I guess. The word that I think you're saying is right. Attached or acknowledged. Is it acknowledged? It's saying that he will dwell with me.
Well, it's a kind of an odd word. But let's see. No, I don't want to do that.
And it even says, like, in the definition of from the root zaval, it says probably to dwell. So I'm like,
let me look it up.
That just was interesting with what you were talking about, the fact that she had to come hire Jacob, basically. And obviously she's like, it's enough that you've taken my husband. Now you want my son's mandrakes or what have you. Then I wonder if that idea of now he will dwell with me is he's come back. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. The verb, if it means, so I'm looking at one of the kind of the classic lexicons here that they explain it as acknowledging as one's lawful wife. Sort of like that she'll be first perhaps, but then it does have, and it only occurs this one time in the whole Hebrew Bible, right here, with that potential meaning. They get live with from well, not really the verb, but from a noun that perhaps relates of a lofty residence where God lives. So, I mean, when a word only occurs one time in the Hebrew Bible, it's pretty difficult to pin down. End up looking at, like, Akkadian has this word of bringing wedding presents into the house of the father-in-law.
Yeah.
So that would be sort of the recognition of a person.
Okay.
It's difficult.
It seems more likely that it's not dwell with, but if you are acknowledging someone as your wife, it would follow then maybe that you would dwell with
Yeah.
her.
I can see that. I mean, if in
yeah.
contrast to what he's clearly living with Rachel.
Yeah.
And so perhaps she's thinking that now he'll live with me.
Mhm.
So I think that's what they're trying to bring out as a way of the dominant wife or something, the favored wife or something like that.
Was he dwelling with Rachel? I had the impression that each woman had her own tent and that Jacob had his third.
It's hard to know like what their house structures were like. I don't know trying to think where we would have that. That makes sense. I mean, he's got a lot of money. This point, living in Laban's land. I only take it that he's living with Rachel in the sense that he's lying with her at night. But yeah, it makes sense that they would have, at least Rachel and Leah would have separate spaces. I'm not sure that Jacob did. Maybe he did. Is there a verse that indicates that?
No, that's just an impression from
Right.
The way that they moved easily between different wives,
Yeah.
and yet was not particularly beholden to any one of them.
Right. Right.
It just felt like each individual had their own tent.
Yeah. And then I imagine that Bilhah would live with Rachel and Zilpah would live with Leah. But it's interesting that they're called wives in this story, but they're still the maidservants. So they're clearly not the honored or favored wives.
I would guess that they had a tent nearby, but not the same tent, because it would be really awkward to have Jacob having sex with the maidservant in the same tent with the owning wife.
Well, in chapter 31, when Laban is trying to find his idols, he went into Jacob's tent, into Leah's tent, into the tent of the two maids, but he did not find them. Then he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's tent.
Okay. Well, that's the verse that we were looking for. So then that does tell us that there are actually more than three tents. Everybody kind of has their own space. Which verse is that?
31, chapter 31.
Yeah.
33.
31, 33. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 31.
Yeah, the tent of Rachel, the tent of Leah, and then there's a tent for the two women, other maidservants. And then, so the tent of Rachel too.
I was reading last week, I think, about this idea of giving your servant, or maybe you would even call them a slave. And whenever they would do that, if it's a servant/slave person as opposed to an equal, then the person that is the master of that servant or slave has rights over that child. So the idea of I'm giving you my servant as opposed to you took another wife means that the actual wife has authority over any children that are born from the servant or slave.
Yeah.
And so that allows for, like with Hagar being the servant of Sarah then is supposedly able to have total authority over Ishmael. And I think the same is true here, that with Zilpah and Bilhah, their respective masters, if you will, are able then to say, this is my son, even though it was basically you're a surrogate, but it's my child.
Right.
And
For sure. There's a lot of parallels between Jacob's story and Abraham's story, or Jacob and his wives' stories. And then there's a lot of parallels between the story that we're reading right now and just sort of the barren women motif, childbearing stories, or Sarah. What's interesting is we have a little bit of a parallel to Isaac and Rebecca, but they seem, it's not nearly as prominent. Of course, like Rebecca deals with barrenness, and she has these twins, and she says, like Rachel does here, she talks about dying in relationship to children. It's like, if this is the way it's going to be, I should just die. Whereas Rachel says, give me children or lest I die. So sort of like this bearing children are what gives life. What I mean, physically does make sense, but it's kind of ongoing life for the heritage.
I am fascinated with the way that Rachel exercises authority over Jacob. That Rachel can say, all right, then he's yours.
Yeah.
And Jacob goes with it.
Yeah.
We tend to think of this as an abusive society, but Jacob is taking orders here. It's like, this is not the patriarchal sense of the guy gives all the orders. He's accepting Rachel's judgment. Okay, you're gonna go, all right.
And that's really parallel to Abraham too. They're very passive. The men are very passive in these stories.
Fascinating.
And
Jacob is so much older. He's like 40 years old when he meets Rachel, and she is a virgin. So she's like, what, 13? And so he's 25 years older than her in any case. And she says, you're going with her. Okay.
Well, I guess it doesn't take him much convincing to sleep around. But along those lines too, just the language of exchange and sort of, it's like the business of having children here, especially in that story of the mandrakes where you have, I mean, she says basically, I have paid your price in exchange for, they've made a deal, like a monetary deal for who has rights to sleep with them. And yeah, you're right. He doesn't put up any fight, but just the language of this is not love language so much as it is business, the kind of the economy of it all. Scott?
We even think about the children's names, especially the wages, Issachar, how would you like to be? Asking mom and dad, how did I get my name? Well, I bought a night with your dad, I knew that was common, to name children something that meant something, but you think even about that, and their lives were forever marked by this struggle. The fact that the children would bear the struggle with them in their names for the rest of their life.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, that comes out really prominently also with like Naphtali. And you have this word play on the wrestlings with God. I have wrestled with my sister. And that's a pretty important line for also what's to come. You have, because Jacob is such this wrestling character. And in that case, let's see where do we have Naphtali? It's down in verse 8 of chapter 30. So Rachel is she's saying, I've wrestled with my sister and I have prevailed. So this will be linked or picked back up in chapter 32, where Jacob wrestles with God and prevails. And the yachal is the same verb there. You have all this symmetry between Jacob and Rachel. They're both shepherds. And then also the kind of the wrestlings, the characterization. Go ahead, Scott.
I guess I'm always looking at a kind of maybe a theological point here or something, but I'm wondering if this isn't a picture in a lot of ways of our own humanity and how we wrestle with God's sovereignty sometimes. And I know that sounds really Calvinistic to say that.
Okay.
I'm sure like Piper
We
would just
believe
love
God
that.
is sovereign.
Yeah. But I do think, I wonder, because it seems like, Rachel gets angry at Jacob for not giving him children, giving her children, and then he's like, well, how am I I'm not God, I can't do this.
Right.
And Leah, Leah's kind of getting frustrated, buying a night with her husband to be able to leverage
Right.
something of her sister. And it's like the whole family is just kind of like back and forth and kind of throwing their hands up. They all have their own things that they want.
Yeah.
And then God just kind of decides there at the end, we'll get to it, but he opens Rachel's womb, and it's like,
yeah,
that's it,
Right. When that happens, it's so abrupt. Like you're anticipating the drama of Rachel being able to conceive, and then it's just like the next Viator, and Rachel conceived and bore a child, or it's almost anticlimactic the way that it's brought up. I think you're making a really important point that just theologically, especially with these patriarchal stories, where God is acknowledged by the narrator and by the characters for every one of these children, that God is the one who opens the womb and gives children. And yet that's really intertwined with the planning and the scheming and of the characters, the human characters. They aren't simply saying, well, if God wills it, right? They're acting in a way that they're doing everything they can, but then when the child is born, I mean, some of these characters do relate to like the exchange, what we talked with Issachar, but even there, well, it does there. Yeah, God, the narrator anyway tells us that God gave Leah says, God has given my wage. God has basically paid my wage when in exchange for what she did with her maidservant. Leah interprets Issachar as a payment from God in exchange for her giving Zilpah to Jacob. So I mean, just think about the theology involved in that. Whereas God is sovereign, it's always God who's doing it, and yet the characters are acting in every way they can to bring about children in this particular story, and that really runs throughout the patriarchal stories. Characters are active.
And today too, we are God's children today, doing everything we can, and fully acknowledging that we are not capable of bringing the results about.
Yeah,
we do all we can as a prayer to ask God, our Father, to complete the whole.
Right.
And so does he do.
Sometimes we view that as an either or. Do I do this or does God do this? Right. And it's always a both and.
It's always a both and. It's always a both and.
I like the idea of agency, that, if you're driving a nail, you're the one driving it, but the hammer is the agent. I mean, you wouldn't drive a nail without a hammer, and you could add more items, your gloves or whatever. But God is the primary agent. We're agents in between doing His will.
Yeah.
Another quick comment on names. Like, imagine carrying one of the names of Hosea's children.
Lo ami, lo ruchama, not my people, no compassion. Yeah. One other thing with the agency, one thing I think is important to recognize is that they're not always acting in ways that we would deem ethical or maybe like the highest level of with morality. So sometimes God is working in spite of the characters, but the narrative doesn't seem to come down on the patriarchs or the agents of these stories or the actors of these stories for any kind of deceit or anything. It's sort of like God is working through that, which is sort of another level of complexity.
I got a question, Lance, on that note.
Okay.
We did a study through Genesis and Exodus recently with our college students, and it's a general observation, and I don't know if it holds water. As my question is, when you look at the covenants that God makes sequentially, like with Noah, with Abraham, with Moses, with David, with Jesus, it seems like there's great elements of grace in all of them, but the requirements get more specific as we go. So you find people under the law of Moses being put to death for minor things, whereas the patriarchs were getting away with major things. And then Jesus really ramps it up in the Sermon on the Mount. So I don't know if that holds water or not. It just seems that in the early days, they were getting away with more than what God would allow as the covenants grew more and more specific. That's a question. If that makes any sense to you, or
it does. I mean, certainly, like the Abrahamic covenant is essentially a promise. Same thing with the Davidic covenant, and to some extent the Noahic covenant, where there are some exceptions, like not to kill people, right? So there's some kind of law, and the way I understand biblical law is to be a revelation of what God wants. So it's a demonstration of God's will. And Sinai is unique because God is giving himself in a really specific and intimate way to the people. So it's like he's giving more of himself, and therefore there is more required of them. That's the way I understand it. So it's really, we have a lot of law because this is God saying, this is who I am. These are my deepest desires. This is what I want for you. And once they have that, it's like to those who have been given more is required. I guess I would take when you bring up Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, I would say the same thing. That it gets even more kind of strict, although of course there's always grace in all of these covenants. But yeah, the patriarchs essentially receive a promise that even in spite of them, there are the only requirements, maybe you all can think of others, like Genesis 17, you have circumcision. Basically, and otherwise it's just kind of keep following me, a really general sense of following God, which they do. Then God would carry out his promise.
I like your insight that God is giving more of himself. That's worth its weight in gold. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, sure. It's big for Exodus for sure.
And it's also that we are learning to trust.
Yeah.
We look at some of these things and we think, but then we realize that when God condemns certain actions, there was a good reason for that.
Yeah.
We learn in the time of Christ, we learn what he's trying to say, care about people.
Right. You kind of have this sense of, I wouldn't say it's strict progressive revelation where God is revealing more and more, but one good example would be like standing stones. When Jacob has his dream at Bethel, right? He stands up his stone, anoints it, names the place. But if we look in Deuteronomy, we're going to see that God is charging the people not to put up these stones, not to worship with idols and so on. And so it's sort of the elimination. But in the Genesis story that we read earlier, it's an act of devotion. So God, but then he reveals more of the problems that are associated with that later too. further generations. Dusty, I saw your hand up a while ago. I don't want to miss out on what you're going to ask or say.
Yeah, it's a very nuts and bolts Hebrew question. It doesn't have a lot of real
I love
insight. I was looking at, like, for instance, in verse 18, the spelling of Issachar.
Yes. Okay.
It's like you have, is it seen? And then there's no indicator of seen or sheen. And you have
Right.
like a doubling dot within the first one. And I was like,
Yes.
what's going on with that?
Good question. It is always spelled like this. So it's the last word of verse 18. If you have your Hebrew Bibles, you can find it there. Right. You see the dagesh in the first scene.
Yeah, which means it doubles, right?
Right.
Effectively.
Dagesh forte, which means that there are two scenes in that one mark. But then you have the second scene in the consonants. This is probably the Masoretic, you have the Masoretes, right, who are doing the copying of the text and also putting the vowels and the vowel pointing and also the dagesh in there. And probably the original spelling, the original pronunciation would have been Issachar, just like we would do it now, but they're writing it actually with two scenes instead of using the dagesh forte to double it. They're actually putting both consonants in, but to the Masoretes, that's sort of really bad grammar. That's violating a rule of the Hebrew that they know. And so they point it with, this is called a kativ kare, where it's written kativ one way, and then you read it a different way. But it's consistently spelled this way and repointed this way, throughout the Hebrew Bible.
First, I was like, is that like a misprint?
Yeah, it looks like it because there's no vowel under the second scene.
Right, and it doesn't have the dot on either side at the top.
True.
To indicate seen or sheen either.
Yeah.
Which is unusual.
Yeah.
So another nuts and bolts, and then we could talk about better things.
Hey, this is Hebrew story hour. Hey, ask your Hebrew questions.
Yeah, but this doesn't have a lot to do with any story, but is from verse 6. With Dan, it has the dagesh forte and the doubling of dalet. I was like, I don't really remember seeing that many other places. Is there a reason?
Right. So you have that. So here you have a verb, right? He is judged. Is that what you're looking at?
Well, and the spelling of Dan at the very end of the verse. Both the danani and the dan at the very end. They're both like that strong. And is it just meaning that the dalet is a very strong pronunciation of it, or does it change it in any way?
No, in that case, the dagesh in the dalet is a different kind of dagesh. So you have a dagesh forte, which demonstrates the doubling of the consonant. We have the dagesh lene that shows up in what we call the Begad Kafat letters.
Yes.
Right. So the dalet is one of those. So because dalet is the first consonant in the word, they put a dagesh lene in there. Historically, there was a distinction in the way that you pronounced a dalet with the dagesh and then a dalet without the dagesh.
Yeah, that's the way I understood it, was that with the dagesh, it was a solid D with your tongue touching the top of your mouth. But without the dagesh, it was more like a vocalized TH.
Right. Like we use in when we say the word the, historically, that's how they would have done the dalet without the dagesh lene. But that sort of differentiation in pronunciation falls out in modern usage.
That is one thing that I have noticed with reading Hebrew and looking at English is there isn't, to my knowledge, there wasn't a Hebrew TH type sound that we have in English.
Right.
That several of the words come through with a TH in them. And I always wondered, but that makes some sense that it probably involves some of those historical pronunciations that, in a sense, have been.
Yeah, exactly.
discarded.
The tav, we always, whether it has a Dagesh forte or Dagesh lene or not, modern pronunciation is just as t. But it's transliterated in the Greek with a theta, a th sound, in several places. So especially in names, when that start with tav, you'll see a th in there, or in the middle of a word, in the kind of the transliteration of the word. It's still a th sound.
Is there a difference between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic Jews today on this? I could imagine the Sephardic Jews making the distinction
Yeah,
between the th and the t, the dh
right.
and the d.
Yeah, there's the Sephardic Jews make all of these distinctions, and they also pronounce the vav as a w sound,
Yeah.
instead of a v sound. So they're maintaining this kind of older historical pronunciation as best as their tradition can tell. I'm not totally up on if the Ashkenazi Jews do some of these or not. The way I read it, and the way that it's almost always taught now, is in coordination with sort of the way modern Jews, or most of modern Jews would read the text in light of modern Hebrew pronunciations.
I think the Sephardic approach makes better sense of what letters they chose and what Dagesh did or did not use.
It definitely represents. Yeah, it probably represents. It certainly represents an older form of pronunciation. But if we teach that Sephardic pronunciation, if I was to teach that at HST, then students would go out and pronounce things in ways that the scholarly community wouldn't. So we sort of have these conventions that we move forward with.
Maybe along the same line, I was interested in the word for mandrakes.
Oh, good. Yeah, I meant to mention that.
Dodaim.
Yeah.
That's it looks an awful lot like the name David.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I heard that had to do with love.
It does. The word for my beloved in Song of Songs is dode. So here we have that. That's probably sometimes mandrakes get associated with love fruit, and actually in Song of Songs they do show up in among the array of fruits and so on. And there may be some kind of play here even in this story about, it's very exchange, like what we talked about, a very economic exchange here, but dode is typically kind of erotic love, or so dudaim maybe sort of associating mandrakes with intimacy or love.
It is true that they're using mandrake root for cancer.
Oh, really?
Your cancer. I'm a little league leader. I work with moms and babies that want to nurse, and have for a whole bunch of years. And some of us have found that different populations use different things, like help a mother's milk to come in, things like that. Usually the mandrake question is just hooted at, that was a fallacy. But if Rachel had a uterine cancer issue, it does not say that the mandrakes immediately caused her to have children. But down the line, she was able to conceive. So I don't know that it's reasonable just to dismiss it as a myth.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, if the story really wanted to make that connection clearer, it could have, in the sense of and Rachel conceived right after this, but perhaps Rachel's conceiving does follow upon her getting the mandrakes. I imagine that she is wanting the mandrakes because of its associations with with love.
Right. Right. Okay.
Yeah. Just looking up a good Song of Songs verse with this. I think we have like Songs 7:13. The mandrakes give forth fragrance, and beside our doors are all choice fruits, new as well as old, which I have laid upon you, O my beloved. And that verse, the word for beloved is dode. So there's like a word play in Song of Songs.
Okay.
Oh.
Dan has a meeting, so he had to leave.
Okay, well, it's 10 o'clock. And so that our hour is up anyway. I can hang out for a few more minutes, but next week we are going to pick up where we're leaving off. It's a really difficult story next week about changing sheep colors and so on. But Laban and Jacob are going to have it out a little bit. So I look forward to our meeting again next week. Invite your friends. Until then, Shalom Lachem.